Hello, my name is Max Klein. I'm a longtime JupyterLab maintainer, and I'm here today to share with you a project that currently funded by my current employer, JP Morgan. Project is called JupyterFS, and the goal is for it to become the next generation of Jupyter file system. So in the beginning, back when Jupyter was still called IPython Notebook, it was just the notebook. There were no ancillary tools, no ancillary views. It was just a notebook. But over time, various tools, including a file browser, got added to it, bringing us to the current implementation of file browser in JupyterLab, which you can see over in the left panel there. And so the current implementation is great. It does a lot of things, a lot of basic things really well. But it also has a large number of limitations, which JupyterFS seeks to overcome or fix. So we could spend a few minutes here talking about all of the various ways in which the current file browser is deficient, talk about the issues with the content stack that powers it. Instead, I'm just going to go through some demos of JupyterFS and show off all the cool new features that aren't present in the current file browser. So yeah, if you want to find all the stuff for yourself, you can find it at our GitHub. The link is down at the bottom there. And so the first thing I'm going to go over is how do you install JupyterFS. Installation of JupyterFS is mostly straightforward. The only tricky part is that we do need to add some custom JSON config to your Jupyter Notebook config.json file. We'll go over exactly how to do that in a second. So first, you just run pip install JupyterFS. Project installs. The next you do, so the pip package includes both a lab extension and a server extension. And so then you need to rebuild JupyterLab itself using this command. Normally, it takes roughly 30-45 seconds for JupyterLab to rebuild. We just skipped ahead for the purpose of this video. Next, you have to set up your server config to use the JupyterFS Contents Manager. And so the instructions for how to do that are here. So you need to add this to this file, the Jupyter Notebook config.json. So for most users, they'll just be in their home directory in the .jupyter folder. So Jupyter Notebook config.json. Then we just copy the text here, copy. And now we can check and see that the installation was successful like this, Jupyter server extension list. And you can see that JupyterFS is enabled. And then JupyterLab extension list. You can see that JupyterFS is present and enabled. Now that we have JupyterFS installed, we can start going over all the cool new features that JupyterFS adds that aren't present in the regular file browser. And as a part of that, I will also go over the basics of how to configure JupyterFS. The first feature I'm going to show off is multiple file browsers. So there are a couple of different ways to configure JupyterFS. The easiest way is just to go to the user settings in the JupyterLab front end. So go to the settings menu, click on Advanced Settings Editor. Then in the JupyterFS tab, you should see this stuff. So the easiest way to get started is just to take the defaults, copy them, and then paste them into your user preferences. Now we won't really need to look at the defaults anymore for a while. So just get rid of those. You don't really need these options. These are mostly for debugging purposes. So just focus on the list of resources. So focus on the list of resources for right now. And the way that you set up a resource is as so. First off, every resource has a name. So just whatever name you like, just a label. So I'm going to point some of these directories to my Git projects. So I'll call this first one JupyterFS. And then the URL is specified, points to the actual resource and specified like so. So for a local resource, call called OSFS. And the reason for that, you can look in the docs, but basically this is all based on top of an older virtual file system called PyFilesystem. So my home directory, my Git directory, and then JupyterFS. And I have now, in addition to the regular file browser, this additional file browser, which if you hover over it, you can see the name that I gave it. And it starts at my JupyterFS project file. And from there, you can add more and more file browsers, as many as you'd like. So some other projects of mine, lab gits, JupyterLab, say. And the new file browsers will pop up as soon as I save these new options. So now I have 4 file browsers, including JupyterLab Git, JupyterLab. JupyterFS is built on top of PyFilesystem, which basically means that it's capable of supporting a file browser onto any kind of remote file system, pretty much that exists. That's way too much stuff to go over, so I'm just going to keep it to one concrete example and show you how to set up a file browser for an S3 bucket. And the detailed instructions for how to do so are at the URL at the bottom here. This describes how you would format the resource URL that you need for your own personal situation. But the way you add an S3 resource is like so. Just like any other resource, it needs a name. So we'll call this S3 test bucket. And then it needs a resource URL. S3 URLs can usually start with S3 in the name of the bucket. And then depending on your own particular circumstances, they're going to need a variety of arguments. In my case, because I'm running on a special local S3 instance and not a real Amazon AWS S3 instance, I need an endpoint URL arg. It's to my local host. And there's the contents of my S3 bucket. With any remote file system resource, often a tricky thing to deal with is authentication. Say you need a username and a password in order to log into some remote resource. How do you enter those? Obviously, you don't want to leave them in plain text in the settings. So JupyterFS offers a dedicated way to deal with these kinds of credentials. Okay, so say I had a Samba resource I wanted to connect to. You define Samba resource similarly to regular resource. So first you start with the name. So say test SMB. And then for the URL, Samba URL start with SMB. And one way I could put in my username and password for my Samba drive would be just directly in the URL. So SMB user, localhost. And then my SMB partition pops up in that new browser. But obviously, this is less than ideal because this involves me saving my username and my password directly to my user settings. So instead of doing that, what I can do is I can use this double bracket notation. So user password as save. And now what pops up is a dialog asking for those key values that are inside those double brackets. So now I can securely put in my credential. And same effect. So right now, JupyterFS has a lot of basic utility, but it's still in very early days in terms of its overall goals. So what lies in the future for JupyterFS? The first thing is, in addition to being able to more flexibly open file browsers, we also want to improve the overall UI UX experience of using the file browser. And so the early design goal is to get an experience that's more like the Finder file browser from OS X. So for example, what I mean, that you have the full tree view, you're able to meaningfully sort tree even when it's expanded. Lots of other nice features like resizable columns, the choice of which columns you want, all this stuff. This is a very early prototype of the new file browser UI that I built on top of another component that a colleague of mine at JP Morgan has been working on, something called regular table. Link is in the slide. And so we have a lot of the basic features implemented. So tree view, for example, resizable columns, woo. And what's really nice is you can actually sort the expanded trees. And more interestingly, you can actually sort on multiple columns at a time. Once the backend for JupyterFS matures a little bit, we'd like to start seriously exploring better ways to more tightly integrate the file browser and the actual notebook in JupyterLab. Because JupyterLab, is supposed to be a platform for data science. Ultimately, we don't want to just be able to browse through the data. We want to be able to integrate it with people's actual, Python workflows. And just to give you an idea of what that might look like, here's an example of a browser notebook integration from an earlier project that I worked on, JupyterLab HDF5. So JupyterLab HDF5 is an extension for JupyterLab, which lets you open up HDF5 files, browse around in them, and browse through their data. But none of that actually helps you directly to consume the data from an HDF5 file in the notebook. So what if there was just some automatic way to write just an import statement, for example, to draw that data into your notebook? Well, for example, like this. And now you can do whatever you want with that data directly in the notebook in Python, in your Python code. Oops. And that's it for JupyterFS for right now. I want to thank my colleagues at JP Morgan, Tim and Andrew, for helping me get this stuff off the ground in the first place. I also want to thank Martin Durant from the FS Spec project for his very helpful suggestions. And thank you, dear listener, for your interest.